Welcome, folks. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. Folks, we'll get started in just a couple. It is 1 o'clock. We'll just give it another minute or so, and then we'll get started. Thank you for your patience. People are continuing to trickle on, so we'll just give it another minute or so. All right, it's 2 minutes after the hour. We'll get started. Just give me a moment to change some things around here. And do that. Okay. Welcome. My name is Mark Castiglione. I'm the Executive Director of the Capital District Regional Planning Commission. And thank you for joining us today for our Planning and Zoning Workshop. Today's session is titled Legislative and Regulatory Update on Environmental Issues in New York State. For those of you who do not know us, CDRPC is a regional planning resource center that serves Albany, Rensselaer, and Saratoga in Schenectady counties. We foster partnerships and collaboration across our region in economic development, environmental protection, water quality planning, and sustainability. We work with partners to address a variety of regional problems. We established this webinar series to help local planners sharpen their skills and as a vehicle for planning and zoning board members to earn the required 4 hours of credit that they're required to get each year. Planning and zoning board members of Appeals members are required by state statute to obtain 4 hours of training. This training, if your municipality allows it, will satisfy your training credit hours. Each attendee seeking planning and zoning board member credit will receive an automatically generated email that will be sent to your email inbox, certifying your attendance at this webinar 24 hours after this webinar concludes. In addition, this session is approved for 1 hour of CM credit for AICP planners. So if you are a certified planner, feel free to claim the credit. Thank you also to our presenting sponsor, Hodgson and Russ. Without whose generous support, we would have to charge you for attending this virtual webinar. So good on them, and good on Whiteman, Osterman, and Hanna for lending their expertise in these matters in this session today. Today's webinar topic again is legislative and regulatory updates on environmental issues in New York State. Just a few housekeeping notes. You can, and we would request that you put questions and answers in the Q&A box. We will try to address those as they come in. However, we anticipate that the bulk of the Q&A will happen after the presentation concludes. This presentation will be archived and available on our website, cdrpc.org, and a video recording of this session is going to be available on our YouTube channel. Legislative and regulatory update on environmental issues in New York State. The 2022 legislative session resulted in several new pieces of legislation expanding the protection of wetlands, addressing the impacts of climate change as part of the air permit application review, and examining the impact on disadvantaged communities as part of the environmental review of permit applications. These changes have potentially wide-ranging impacts on the practice of planning and zoning. And we're lucky that we are joined today by two experts in this regard. Teresa Bachner, who's a partner with Whiteman, Osterman, and Hanna. She had many years of environmental law experience, and you would be mistaken if you ever wanted to go up against her in environmental legal action. So just forewarning there. And of course, Molly Parlin, she's an associate with Whiteman, Osterman, and Hanna, and she specializes in the firm's environmental practice. She's an NYU graduate with a degree in environmental studies, and she wanted to do good for the world, so she decided to become a lawyer so that she could make sure she was able to protect the environment by using the tools that we have at our disposal in the legal system. So without any further ado, I will introduce Teresa to start the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I will freely admit that I always feel odd speaking to an audience who is not there, but that is not there in reality, although they're in spirit. The purpose of this session is really to talk about some new and immediate issues that are coming up. I always find it more interesting to talk about new things, and there is a lot that is new both on the federal and state level, and we tried to cherry pick the things that are more interesting as well as more immediately relevant to municipalities and planners, so that we could participate in this event with the Capital District Regional Planning Commission, who we really appreciate all the efforts that they make to keep everybody trained and up to speed. Molly Parlin is going to kick this off. She's an associate in our environmental practice, and she is really our expert on climate change issues and how all the new programs at the state are sort of infiltrating and affecting many areas that relate to planning and regulation, often in unexpected and new ways. So Molly, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Teresa. Hi, everyone. You can go ahead and go to slide 3, please. So the first thing that we're going to cover today is the relatively new Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act and how it's being implemented by the state of New York. Climate leadership and community protection is a bit of a mouthful, so you'll also hear the act referred to as the climate law or CLCPA or sometimes CLCPA. The CLCPA went into effect in 2020, and it sets very ambitious goals for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions statewide. Specifically, it mandates greenhouse gas emissions reductions from every sector of New York's economy. It calls for a 40% reduction in emissions by 2030. 100% zero emissions electricity from clean energy sources by 2040, and an 85% reduction in emissions by 2050. It also establishes a Climate Action Council, which is a 22-member committee composed of state and agency officials and industry authorities. And that council is tasked with preparing a scoping plan. The scoping plan sets out how the state of New York is going to achieve this ambitious clean energy and climate agenda. So in 2021, the council released their draft scoping plan. The plan underwent a very robust public comment period. It included, I think, 11 public hearings across the state. More than 35,000 written comments were received. And the draft scope was actually recently approved, and the final version is expected to be released soon. As far as the community protection aspect of the Act goes, one of the cornerstones of the Act is to identify and consider the impacts of implementing the new Act and all other regulatory actions going forward on underserved and vulnerable populations. You're probably familiar with the phrase environmental justice community, which describes an underserved or vulnerable population. So the state has sort of dispensed with that term and is now referring to these communities under the new climate law as disadvantaged communities. And I'll explain more about how the state is addressing these communities in a bit. Next slide, please. But I want to get back to the efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that are already underway across the state. So first, state agencies have been charged with considering consistency with the Act in all administrative decision-making, including permitting. So far, we're really only seeing these consistency determinations done in the context of state air permitting by the Department of Environmental Conservation. So for example, an applicant for an air permit is required to prepare and submit this objective analysis of all of the project's greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 equivalent emissions. This includes any upstream, downstream, or indirect emissions attributable to the project. And if the project is found to increase emissions, the applicant has to then propose alternatives or mitigation measures. If the Department of Environmental Conservation still can't justify permitting the project, it will be denied. And to date, we've actually seen DEC deny 3 different facilities' air permit applications for not being able to meet this standard. Next slide, please. In addition to consistency determinations in permitting, we're also seeing sister legislation related to energy efficiency standards and the electrification of buildings, also aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The Advanced Building Codes, Appliance, and Equipment Efficiency Standard Acts of 2022 is going to go into effect this June. And that legislation calls for NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, to adopt new efficiency standards for products and appliances that are going to reduce energy and water consumption. And these standards are going to apply to the construction of any new building and any addition to or alteration of an existing building. The first batch of these standards is going to take effect in June, and it will cover all kinds of things like gas fireplaces, sprinklers, toilets, etc. So any manufacturer, distributor, retailer, or installer who's offering any of what going forward will be non-compliant products could be subject to enforcement. That could include financial penalties. Next slide. There are also two other bills that were introduced this legislative session that we're watching closely. One is the All Electric Building Act that prohibits infrastructure, building systems, or other equipment used for the combustion of fossil fuels in any new construction. The other is the Gas Transition and Affordable Energy Act, which effectively removes all subsidies driving the expansion of gas systems. It requires the Public Service Commission to adopt rules to decommission the state's gas system. So as you can imagine, if either of these acts is signed into law, they'll have sweeping impacts on development around the state. Next slide. I want to return to this concept of disadvantaged communities because it is such a huge component of the Climate Act. So this map shows disadvantaged communities that have been identified by the state so far. Those are in purple. And these are still subject to change, but they're expected to be finalized this spring. Basically, the state is going to direct additional funding to these communities. They're supposed to receive 40% of the overall benefits of state spending on clean energy and energy efficiency. In addition, state agencies are going to be tasked with reviewing impacts on any community that's considered a disadvantaged community, again, in all administrative decision-making, which we'll primarily see in environmental permitting. 2 slides ahead, please. So the Climate Act charged the Climate Justice Working Group with developing the criteria for how to identify a disadvantaged community. They used 45 indicators to identify state census tracts, which are considered disadvantaged. And you can see from this chart that the indicators are very closely related to population, with New York City having by far the most. Next slide. The indicators include climate-related risks such as susceptibility to flooding or extreme heat. Next slide. And here are the indicators in a little bit more detail. They also include health vulnerabilities like asthma and COPD rates, things like emergency department visits, and then also several socioeconomic factors like race, ethnicity, and income. Next slide. The last piece of legislation that I want to touch on is the 2023 Environmental Siting Bill. Beginning June of this year, all SECRA review is going to incorporate a review of impacts on disadvantaged communities. So this means that lead agencies are going to be required to consider whether a project may cause or increase a disproportionate burden on a disadvantaged community. So, for example, if a town board is acting as lead agency, it's going to be required to assess impacts to disadvantaged communities during its initial determination on whether an environmental impact statement is needed. And any environmental impact statements prepared are going to have to assess the effects of the action on disadvantaged communities. And this includes whether or not it would cause or increase a disproportionate pollution burden in the area. Next slide. This same piece of legislation also amends the uniform procedures governing state permitting. So major permit applicants will need to prepare an existing burden report, and that will assess pollution in the surrounding community. A state agency is not going to be able to approve or renew a permit if it may cause or contribute to the disproportionate pollution burden. This is also going to impact environmental permitting in a significant way going forward. Next slide. Okay, so before I turn it over to Teresa, I'll just wrap up by saying that there are all kinds of Climate Act implementing regulations in the pipeline, most of which will come from DEC, but some other agencies as well. So 2024 is going to bring a slew of brand new sector-specific guidance and rules. So this effort by the state of New York is something to keep an eye on over the next couple of years. Teresa, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks very much, Molly. Lots more to look forward to. Maybe if you put on your mute, that'll help. Okay. Excellent. So we're going to talk now about new changes that relate to enhanced protection of natural resources. These are both federal programs and state programs, and in a lot of cases, they interact with one another as well. We're looking specifically at wetlands, waters of the United States, and northern long-eared bats. So next slide, please. So the enhanced wetlands protections are a result of what I can only say is constant change at the federal level with respect to the Clean Water Act in Section 404. And at issue at the heart of this is a continuing evaluation and dispute over what constitutes a water of the United States. And a water of the United States would include wetlands, it would include streams, it could include lakes, rivers, ponds. It is an incredibly expansive program in terms of the extent to which the federal government has an impact on land use and planning in all states throughout the United States. This discussion on what is regulated by the federal government has really been going on since the late 80s. And recently, there have been several shifts at the federal level that have been a little bit hard to keep track of and even harder to understand. So to start with, I'm just going to talk briefly about waters of the United States and what laws affect the definition of waters of the United States. So first we had a definition that really went back to 1986 in the Code of Federal Register, in the CFR. And that definition was brief, and it resulted in a lot of guidance being issued, and it also resulted in a lot of Supreme Court cases. And one of those Supreme Court cases that pretty much everybody has heard of has the catchy name of Swank, which relates to whether or not the federal government has the right to regulate a pond, a resource that does not have any contribution into or from a federally navigable water. So back in the day, the issue was federally navigable waters, and at what point a tributary that's connected to a federally navigable water becomes regulated by the Army Corps of Engineers. So from 1986 to roughly 2015, we had a regulatory definition that was interpreted by the courts. And the courts really tried to determine what characteristics of a water of the United States would render it so significant that it was regulated by the federal government. So in addition to the Swank case, the one involving the isolated wetland, there were also two cases relatively recent, Rapanos and Carabala. And those two cases were looking at what characteristic about a tributary to a traditionally navigable water would render that tributary regulated by the federal government. And they looked specifically at whether there was a significant whether there was a significant nexus between that, a significant nexus between that water and the traditionally navigable water. And they looked at also wetlands that would be adjacent to those tributaries. So, and it looks like I may have gotten ahead of my slide here a little bit in terms of federal definition. There we go. And the federal definition of WOTUS, as I was saying, relates to the Supreme Court cases that interpreted it before 2015. In 2015, the federal government adopted regulations under President Obama that would have increased the reach of these, of the definition of waters of the United States to take the federal jurisdiction into areas that it had previously not been considered regulated by the federal government. Those included a per se rule on the wetlands that were within 1,000 feet of tributaries to traditionally navigable waters. And it increased the jurisdiction over resources in the western part of the country in particular that are relatively ephemeral. That rule was challenged in the courts. And when the next administration came in, the Trump administration, they repealed that rule and they proposed a new rule, which I'm just going to call for convenience, the 2020 Trump rule. The 2020 Trump rule went back to the 1986 regulations to find more of its definition of what waters of the United States was. And it also looked at issues like exclusions from jurisdiction for man-made resources like stormwater basins, and also addressed many of the concerns that agricultural interests had in trying to sort of dial back the federal regulation of wetlands as it affected farming. That rule was then challenged in court, and that rule was overturned, and the Biden administration came in and really from the beginning indicated that it was going to overturn the Trump rule, not move forward with that, and instead put in place the original 1986 rule, along with some additional language to cover Supreme Court cases such as Swank, Rapinos, and Carabella, to make sure that it was consistent with what the Corps had done previously in terms of regulating these resources. So over the course of 10 years, really less than 10 years, we've had the 1986 definition of WOTUS, we've had the 2015 definition of WOTUS, we've had the 2020 definition of WOTUS, and now this March we have the new definition put in place by the Biden administration, and that's the one that you see up on the slide here. From a resource perspective, the biggest change in what they did here in 2023 is they took out all the exclusions that had been added by the Trump administration, and they made it much more a case-by-case determination looking at significant nexus. and whether the wetlands adjacent to waters of the United States, including other wetlands and other tributaries. But in terms of practicalities, in the upstate New York area, the new definition of wetlands is almost undistinguishable from the 1986 definition. And the only thing it really carries forward, what I would say clearly, is that isolated wetlands and ponds are not going to be regulated by the federal government as WOTUS. But when it comes to any tributary to a traditionally navigable water, so you may have the Hudson River, and then you may have a number of resources or smaller rivers and streams that come off the Hudson, it is likely, as long as you have permanently flowing water, that it's going to be considered significant to have a significant nexus to the traditionally navigable water. So what does that mean? Well, the way the Corps looks at streams is they consider ephemeral streams to be regulated streams if they have any groundwater contribution. They consider intermittent streams to be regulated streams because during parts of the year, they have permanently flowing water. So I would say the reach of the program, at least as you look at it from a planning or a regulatory perspective, is it's sort of business as usual. It's not a substantial change. And then the other thing I would just say is there's some indication in the preamble to these regulations that they're going to not rely on jurisdictional determinations that were made under the Trump rule. So that's something to keep in mind when you're looking at projects and considering projects that have been going on for a substantial period of time. So if we could pop back to the freshwater wetlands slide. So last year, the legislature adopted a little bit unexpectedly a very significant amendment to the Article 24, the freshwater wetlands law. And always in the past, at the state level, you could count on the freshwater wetlands map giving you an indication on a per county basis what was regulated by the state. Now, of course, with the federal government, and if you just heard any words of what I said, you have a lot of uncertainty over what is regulated or not regulated. By contrast, at the state level, it was pretty clear what was regulated, and that was mapped freshwater wetlands. And if the state wanted to amend those wetlands, then they had to go through a substantial mapping process, which also put people on notice that there was going to be a substantial change. In this revised definition, if you will, of freshwater wetlands at the state level, which are regulated, they're no longer going to rely on the freshwater wetlands map. It doesn't have any regulatory significance. It just shows the approximate location of wetlands. So like we do with the Army Corps, for every project where there are wetlands on the site of any significant size, you're going to have the Department of Environmental Conservation come out and look to see if it's a freshwater wetlands regulated by the state. Now, it's not clear that that's going to be a significant added burden on projects, since you pretty much have to do the same things with the Army Corps of Engineers. But it is a significant added burden when you're doing your due diligence on projects, because you may need to expend a substantial amount of money up front to get some answers that in the past you could just get answered by going to the freshwater wetlands map. The other thing that they're doing is over the course of a few years, they are taking the 12.4 tenths of an acre of wetlands standard and changing it so that it includes wetlands of unusual importance, no matter what size they are. So they can be much less than 12.4 acres in size. They can be 0.4 acre in size. It just has to meet the criteria for unusual importance. In addition to that, for wetlands which are not of unusual importance, in a few years, wetlands that are 7 acres or, 7 acres or less or more in size will be regulated. So they're taking that 12.4 tenths of an acre and moving it down to 7 acres and change. Most significantly, in the short haul at least, they have a very liberal definition, or what you call, I guess, expansive definition of unusual importance. And I don't know, I don't think I have this on a slide, but basically the criteria include things like it's located within or adjacent to an urban area. It contains habitat for an essential behavior of an endangered or threatened species or species of special concern. It also automatically makes any wetland that has Class 1 wetland characteristics a wetland of unusual importance. If it's located in a floodway, or if it has wetlands and wetlands functions and values that are of local or regional significance. So the definition is fairly broad for wetlands of unusual importance. And so the expectation is that you're going to see, particularly where there are projects with smaller wetlands on them, you're going to have more people coming out and characterizing those wetlands as of unusual importance, particularly people who may not be happy about a particular project or activity. And then I would say, lastly, they're really setting up a situation where I believe they're going to take jurisdiction over wetlands that are pretty much federally regulated wetlands. And those wetlands will then have a 100-foot buffer around them, as do all Article 24 wetlands. And that will significantly contract the amount of land that you may have on property. The 100-foot buffer around a 1 acre wetland can, really affect substantially more than 4 acres of a piece of property, particularly because wetlands are natural resources and they don't come to be in shapes that, like circles or squares, that enable you to work with them a little bit better. So let me just talk briefly about when these changes kick in. So pretty much 2025, the definition of wetlands of unusual importance, those wetlands will start to be regulated. DEC right now is working on regulations to go with the legislation. I have not seen any draft regulations yet, but I know they're working on them. On January 1st, 2028, all wetlands 7.4 acres and larger will be regulated by the state, even if they're not of unusual importance. So that acreage goes from 12 and change to 7 and change. So this is the the wetlands laws in the state haven't really changed since the 70s. It's not really surprising that they're changing now, but the law that was proposed was substantially different than the one in the last legislative session that had been floated. And it really doesn't address the 100-foot buffer issue and the difficulties that's going to start with respect to really construction projects. It really will put it will make it difficult to find property where you can do the work without having the obligation to get a freshwater wetlands permit, particularly in upstate New York, because it is fairly wet up here anyhow. So next slide, this is the northern long-eared bat in all his beauty. Previously, the northern long-eared bat was considered a threatened species under the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service regulations. And now they have put out a Federal Register notice that designates them as endangered. That regulation takes effect at the end of March. Here, we're very close to the end of March, which is hard to believe. And it essentially means that the regulation and protection of this species will be ramped up. And in New York State, at least, the expectation is that when you go on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Survey or their U.S. Fish and Wildlife IPAC site, it will show that northern long-eared bats are present in every county in New York State, which will then require you to determine whether the project that you have as it's designed or the activity is going to have an impact on this new endangered species. One great thing that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does in the Federal Register notice is for the regulated community, they try to describe those activities which will be lightly regulated or not regulated at all, as well as those activities that will be regulated. And for instance, just to give you a sense of it, so they talk about activities that are unlikely to result in the take of the species or its habitat involve minimal tree removal and vegetation management activities that occur any time of the year outside of suitable forested wooded habitat and more than 5 miles from known or potential hibernacula. And hibernacula are the caves that the bats live in the winter, which are absolutely protected. Most of the issues do not surround hibernacula, but instead they surround cutting down trees outside the caves in which the bats may have a maternity colony. So they come out of the caves in the spring and they give birth to their young called pups, and they live in, sunward facing trees under bark that's shaggy or in crevices, and also in some cases in buildings. And the goal is to, keep the young warm and successfully reproduce during the summer season. So in the past, when the bat was just denominated as threatened, what they did with restrictions is to ensure that you were not going to have an adverse effect or take of a northern long-eared bat, you would do your tree clearing in the winter. Basically, you could cut down trees from November 1st to March 31st. Then in the summer, you would not engage in tree clearing activity unless you could demonstrate that that the BADs did not use the site. The BAD surveys can be quite extensive, lengthy, and costly. So the majority of developers, municipalities, anyone who had to cut down trees, they would have done it during those timeframes in order to avoid a take. Now, however, it's a little bit less clear that merely a restriction on the time of year that you cut trees will be sufficient. So they now say unauthorized removal or destruction of trees and other natural and man-made structures being used as roosts by the northern long-eared bat would be likely to result in a take of the species. Unauthorized removal or exclusion from buildings or artificial structures being used as roost sites by the species, resulting in a take of the species. So they're really for those areas, particularly where they are less than 5 miles from a hibernacula, and you have trees that are over 3 inches in height, 3 inches at breast height diameter for the tree, then you're going to have to undertake an analysis to determine whether you're going to likely have an adverse effect on the species. And I'd say the biggest amount of uncertainty that this introduces is just the extent to which tree clearing is going to be regulated, even within those periods of time when the bats are in the hibernacula. And hopefully, as soon as the regs take effect, or, you know, because that time is passing, hopefully they will soon issue more specific guidance on how development projects or municipal projects are going to be reviewed with respect to clearing of trees that you need to clear, obviously, in order to build a project. So next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the state attempts to take over local zoning type jurisdiction. And so if you could go to the next slide, please. So one of the most complained about laws that take over jurisdiction for projects that are front of mind for people are solar and wind utility scale projects. So in the past, there were always electric generating siting statutes, Article 10, which has lived several times over legislatively, and even before Article 10, Article 8. And for electric generating projects and also for certain sized utility lines, the state has clearly vested authority over those resources, or over those types of projects, which bring electricity to us all, in the Public Service Commission. So there's been a very long history in the state of saying some things are so significant and are so regional in their impact, and in some cases, quite frankly, statewide in their impact, that we, the state, are not going to defer to local zoning and planning with respect to those projects. A few years ago, the state took it a step further and specifically crafted legislation that applies to renewable electric generating facilities like solar and wind projects. And they created a new office to review those projects, taking it away from the Public Service Commission and their staff who had previously served these projects. and they put it in what's known as the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, or ORES. Now, that movement from Article 10 to ORES has been significant because it is much easier for the developer to argue under the legislation that was adopted for renewable projects that a zoning regulation, a substantive zoning regulation that's being imposed by the local municipality is too burdensome. And in the regulations and law, what it allows the developers to do is identify for the siting board and ORES all of the substantive regulations that would apply at the local levels, and what of those local regulations are too burdensome. So originally, the Public Service Commission was really holding developers to what I would call a somewhat harder standard to establish that something was unreasonably burdensome. With the new regulations and the new program, it is very much easier for the developers to establish that local substantive laws are too burdensome. They have used reasons for being burdensome as including the cost, including the difficulty of the project, increasing the difficulty of the project, and and really determinations by ORES that the buffers that are being imposed at some through some local municipalities are unreasonable. So there's a history of the state stepping in where renewables, in this case, are a key part of achieving their climate goals that Molly just went over. So not surprisingly, and I would also say, in addition to renewables, there are several other programs over the years that the state has taken exclusive jurisdiction over. Things like group homes, things like hazardous waste facilities, to a very large degree, mining and mined land reclamation. The state almost exclusively regulates that. So there is precedent for it. There have been lots of challenges to the state taking over jurisdiction in that fashion. But those cases have been unsuccessful. So that brings us to this new, most interesting example of the governor proposing in the budget bill, and I think we can go to the next slide. In the budget bill that came out earlier this year, the governor specifically included legislation to increase housing throughout New York State, with a focus on affordable and multifamily housing, as well as a focus on affordable multifamily housing near transit centers. So the proposal, which is very creative, is essentially taking the position that local governments are using land use to exclude certain types of housing, and in some cases, any housing, due to concerns about density of housing, which is often sort of a code for concern, not about the density of the housing, but perhaps the people who are occupying the housing. So they're trying to overcome this use of zoning in order to make sure that in many areas throughout the state, affordable housing may be available for the first time, or even in some areas, multifamily housing may be available for the first time. And I think they're practically looking at transit areas, areas near trains, train stations, subways, you know, anything which can reduce people's reliance on cars and also provide housing opportunities. And some of the ways in which they're proposing to do this is really trying to exempt some of these projects from concerns which have been expressed maybe as State Environmental Quality Review Act concerns, or concerns about impacts on aesthetics or community character. They're sort of taking that out of the equation and saying that in certain areas, or if a municipality does not provide, 3% of this housing on their own, such that they have a safe harbor, then it's going to be possible for developers to appeal decisions or failure to make decisions, if you will, of local government to housing boards to show that they're effectively being prevented from providing this much needed housing. It also has some suggestions for some really creative ways to make it easier to get lots approved, including encouraging municipalities to adopt legislation which allows for a building permit or a very abbreviated administrative process where you want to do lot line adjustments or you want to do very small subdivisions. And that again is to increase available lots, increase the number of housing units. They also have very specific guidance on what they feel is a reasonable setback for a property. And whoever drafted this spent a lot of time looking at zoning codes and determining, what types of provisions stand in the way of densely developed housing. So right now, we have no idea if this law is going to survive the 2023 budget or the 2023 legislature. The legislature and pretty much every municipality in New York State has indicated that they don't like this plan. They don't like that it's top down, that it's the state taking over local decision-making to this degree. And there have been ideas floated on the legislature side for tax credits and other things to act as an incentive for development of affordable and multifamily housing. So right now, in the glorious tradition of New York State, the governor and the legislature are in the process of negotiating whether this will move forward in some form, whether it will be pitched entirely, and whether there will be some other proposal to try to deal with an identified lack of housing in many areas of the state. So I think it's an interesting set of bills to look at. I would encourage anybody to take a look at it. I wouldn't give it a 50% chance. But I'm sure that something will come out of this that will be keyed towards improving the likelihood that that there'll be more housing built in New York State, particularly multifamily and affordable. We're available for questions if you guys have any.
All right, we had a couple questions submitted in the Q&A. I know I copied them over to Molly. And thank you for a great presentation, Molly and Teresa. And thank you for the reminder, Teresa, that no one is safe while the legislature's in session. Molly, do you want to try to tackle the questions that came in through the Q&A?
Sure. There was one question about whether disproportionate impacts are going to be measured on a regional basis or only within the municipality where the project is located. It's going to be more of a regional analysis in that you can envision a situation where there's a project located in a municipality that was not identified as a disadvantaged community, but perhaps the adjacent municipality was identified as a disadvantaged community. And by the way, they're not going to be, a disadvantaged community may not encompass an entire municipality. It's not going to, the boundaries won't be drawn like that. I think they're more fluid, but you can envision a situation where the project is on one side of the line, but perhaps its air emissions would still impact the adjacent disadvantaged community. So in that sense, I think to the extent, any impacts could be felt by the adjacent community, the analysis would be more regional. Teresa, there was a question about
irrigation water. I can see it. Okay. It says, if a farmer used irrigation water from a small seasonal wetlands currently less than 12.4 acres in size, are you saying that now that irrigation water source may not be permitted? Who is the determinant of this? So, so the key word there is farmer. So Article 24 of the Environmental Conservation Law has always been very desirous of allowing agricultural activities to continue. So until we see the regulations that DEC develops, we don't know if they're sort of changing that tact, but I doubt it. I think agricultural use of wetlands will continue to be treated very differently than seeking to develop wetlands or build structures in wetlands or fill wetlands. If your person is doing a water withdrawal, just be aware that water withdrawals, even agricultural water withdrawals, are regulated by DEC depending upon the quantity under the water withdrawal law. So you should take a look at that. That changed. I embarrassed myself trying to guess, but it was substantially before COVID. So it would have been 2007, 2008, I believe that changed. And I just want to say that neither, so the new legislation does not kick in until DEC adopts regulations, and it's 1/1/25. So that wetland regulation where it identifies wetlands of unusual importance as now being regulated doesn't kick in until 1/1/25. And the regulation and the legislation that would regulate anything 7.4 acres and larger doesn't kick in until 1/1/28. And that's in the last paragraph of the bill. So I would say it's unlikely, certainly until 1/1/25, that the farmer is going to be affected by the change in wetlands regulations.
The question came in from me, but I did not ask it, which is interesting, but I would be curious to know the answer.
What answer is that?
I don't know. It just said the question is, thanks for a great presentation. Question regarding the upgraded long-eared bat protections. If a project is nearing final approval, but not final or started, could there be some upgraded protections for the species and reducing the size of the development project?
The answer to that question is yes. Until in New York State, until you are vested, which involves commencement of construction, you are not really protected from any changes of regulations or zoning or anything else. That's one of the most challenging things about doing projects in New York State. So it is entirely possible for many projects which have been significantly delayed over the years to have changes in federal regulation affect their ability to complete construction of their project.
Great. I also have one other question related to the changes in seeker environmental review that kick in shortly. So if this may be related to your answer that you just gave, but if a municipality is in the process of completing an EAF, and they've completed the EAF and they haven't taken the actual action to approve it, do they have to then go back to the drawing board and include all the additional provisions that the law dictates with the changes?
I believe that this will become effective, I think, end of June 23rd. There is a provision in the legislation that protects any initial determinations of significance that were made prior to that date. So if after June 23rd, if a lead agency has completed the full EAF but hasn't made a determination of significance, they would have to go back and include a review of impacts to disadvantaged communities.
Yeah, you often see even land use moratoriums keyed off whether or not there's been a determination of significance. So it makes sense to use that as the turning point.
Gotcha. Well, I'll make sure that we have our EAF adopted and determinations made before that date.
Good idea.
You might be able to beat the bat yet, who knows?
Well, we have a project right now and I heard they're cutting down trees. So hopefully the end of the month deadline still is in play.
Yeah, the northern long-eared bat as an endangered species was made effective until March 31st.
Great.
And I have a feeling that was why.
That's the deadline we gave them.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, this has been a great presentation and thank you again, Teresa and Molly, and hopefully we'll do it again this time next year. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to either one of them or send an email to CDRPC and we can redirect. We'll be back again at the same bat time, same bat channel next week with another compelling webinar. So I hope everyone has a great week. Take care.